Some days you realize your life is about to change forever, and you can feel it in your bones. For Ephraim Cole, that day came when a dying horse stumbled up to his mountain cabin carrying something impossible. The old mountain man had been living alone for 15 years, content with his quiet life in the Montana wilderness. He'd seen wild horses before, but this paint mare was different. She was starving, bloodied, and barely alive. What made Ephraim's hands shake wasn't her condition. It was what she carried in the cavalry saddlebag strapped to her side, a newborn baby, somehow still breathing after days in the frozen mountains. The child's arrival would bring back memories Ephraim thought he'd buried forever, along with secrets about a missing cavalry patrol and a promise he made 30 years ago. What oath had Ephraim sworn that would pull him back into a world he'd left behind? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Absaroka Range, painting the snow-covered pines in shades of amber and gold. Ephraim Cole stood on the wraparound porch of his log cabin, a steaming cup of coffee warming his weathered hands as he surveyed the wilderness that had been his sanctuary for 15 years. At 62, his hair had turned the color of winter frost, and deep lines mapped the geography of a life lived outdoors, but his eyes remained sharp as a hawk's, missing nothing in the vast expanse below. The cabin sat on a natural shelf of rock, 8,000 feet above sea level, with a commanding view of the valley that stretched toward Pine Hollow. Ephraim had chosen this spot deliberately, high enough to see anyone approaching, remote enough that most folks wouldn't bother making the climb. A man could think clearly up here, away from the noise and complications that seemed to follow civilization wherever it took root. He'd built the cabin with his own hands, using logs from the surrounding forest and stones from the mountain creek that bubbled down from the glacier above. Every beam and board told a story of careful planning and patient work. The structure was solid, designed to withstand the brutal mountain winters when snow piled 8 feet deep and the wind howled like a living thing trying to tear the roof away. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves holding books on everything from animal tracking to military tactics, poetry to practical medicine. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires that had kept him warm through the long, solitary nights. Most mornings followed the same comforting pattern. Ephraim would rise before dawn, build up the fire, and prepare a simple breakfast of eggs from his chickens, bacon from the smokehouse, and bread he baked himself. He'd check on his small herd of goats, split wood for the day's needs, and tend to the dozen tasks that kept a mountain homestead running smoothly. His garden, now dormant under winter's blanket, had provided vegetables through the growing season. The root cellar held enough preserved food to last until spring, and his hunting skills ensured fresh meat when needed. But this morning felt different. A restlessness had settled in his bones, an unease he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the dreams that had been visiting him more frequently, memories of another time, another life, when he'd worn the blue uniform of the Union Army and carried the weight of other men's lives on his shoulders. In those dreams, he heard the thunder of cannons, smelled the acrid smoke of black powder, and felt the terrible responsibility of command pressing down like a physical weight. Ephraim walked to the small wooden chest that sat beneath his bedroom window. His fingers traced the worn brass corners before lifting the lid with reverence. Inside, wrapped in faded blue cloth, lay the Congressional Medal of Honor he'd received after the Battle of Antietam. The bronze star felt heavy in his palm, its weight seeming far greater than the few ounces of metal would suggest. Below it lay a daguerreotype of his unit, 23 young men standing in formation, their faces serious beneath their military caps. Of those 23, only 7 had survived the war. Captain Ephraim Cole had led them through some of the bloodiest campaigns of the conflict. Fredericksburg, where they'd charged up that terrible hill against Confederate positions that seemed impregnable. Chancellorsville, where they'd held the line when everything around them collapsed into chaos. Gettysburg, where his tactical brilliance had helped turn the tide on the second day of fighting. The men had called him Iron Coal for his unshakable composure under fire. But Ephraim knew the truth inside. He'd been terrified every single day. The war had ended 34 years ago, but its echoes still reverberated through his soul. He'd tried to return to normal life, had even gotten married to a sweet woman named Rebecca, who'd waited for him through 4 years of hell. But the nightmares wouldn't stop, and the guilt of survival when so many good men had died ate at him like a cancer. Rebecca had been patient, loving, understanding, which somehow made it worse. When she died of consumption 5 years after the war, Ephraim had taken it as a sign that he was meant to be alone. He drifted west, working various jobs, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. Montana Territory had called to him with its vast spaces and promise of solitude. Here, a man could disappear into the wilderness and never be found if he was careful. Ephraim had been very careful. The people of Pine Hollow, 12 miles down the mountain, knew him only as the hermit who occasionally came to town for supplies. They treated him with the respectful distance mountain folk showed to anyone who chose to live so far from civilization. Some probably thought he was half crazy, and maybe they weren't entirely wrong. But crazy or not, he'd found a kind of peace in the rhythm of seasons, in the honest work of survival, in the simple pleasure of watching eagles soar through the crystalline air. His neighbors were the creatures of the high country bears that emerged from hibernation each spring, mountain goats that navigated impossible cliff faces, and wolves whose howls provided a wild symphony on moonlit nights. Ephraim respected them all, understanding that he was a guest in their domain. He'd learned to read the signs they left, to understand their patterns and territories, to coexist without conflict. It was a delicate balance, but one that suited him. The closest thing he had to human friendship was his relationship with Chief Running Bear of the Crow tribe, whose people had hunting grounds in the valley below. The chief was a man of few words but deep wisdom, and he'd come to respect Ephraim's careful stewardship of the mountain. Once or twice a year, they would share a pipe and speak of the changing seasons, the movement of game, the subtle shifts in the land that only those who truly observed could detect. It was enough, more than enough, for a man trying to outrun his past. But lately, even that carefully constructed solitude felt fragile. The dreams were becoming more vivid, more frequent. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night, certain he'd heard cannon fire echoing off the peaks. Other times, he'd catch himself listening for the bugle calls that had once structured his days. It was as if something was stirring in the deep places of memory, preparing to surface whether he wanted it to or not. Ephraim closed the wooden chest and returned to the kitchen, where he began preparing his usual breakfast. The familiar motions, cracking eggs, slicing bacon, stoking the fire, helped settle his mind. Whatever restlessness plagued him this morning, it would pass. Everything always passed, given enough time and distance. That was the one lesson the war had taught him that he'd never forgotten. This, too, shall pass. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the pines with a sound like distant voices. Ephraim paused in his cooking, listening. There was something different about the wind today, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd learned to trust such instincts during the war. They'd saved his life more times than he could count. He moved to the window and peered out at the trail that wound up from the valley. Nothing moved except the swaying branches of the evergreens. But the feeling persisted, a certainty that change was coming whether he welcomed it or not. After 15 years of careful solitude, something was about to disturb the peace he'd worked so hard to build. Ephraim finished preparing his breakfast and sat down to eat, but the food tasted like dust in his mouth. His eyes kept returning to the window, scanning the forest for signs of whatever was coming. Because something was coming, he could feel it in his bones, in the very air around him, The question was whether he would be ready for it when it arrived. The old soldier in him began to stir, noting exits and defensive positions, assessing resources and potential threats. It was a mindset he'd tried to leave behind, but apparently some habits died harder than others. Perhaps they never truly died at all, just lay dormant until circumstances called them back to life. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning frost, Ephraim cleaned his dishes and went about his morning chores. But part of his attention remained focused on that mysterious sense of approaching change, like a man listening for footsteps in an empty house. Whatever was coming for him up this mountain, he would meet it as he'd met everything else, with careful preparation and the steady courage that had carried him through 34 years of trying to forget. The past, it seemed, was not quite finished with Captain Ephraim Cole. The sound came just after noon, a rhythmic thudding that didn't match any of the forest's natural rhythms. Ephraim set down his axe and cocked his head, listening. The noise grew closer, accompanied by labored breathing and the scrape of something dragging across rocky ground. He moved toward the cabin's front porch, every instinct sharpened to a fine edge. Through the screen of pine trees, a horse emerged into the clearing. But calling it a horse seemed generous. The animal was barely standing, its ribs clearly visible beneath a coat that had once been the beautiful paint pattern of white and brown, but now appeared dull and lifeless. Blood darkened its legs from mid-cannon to hoof, and foam flecked its muzzle. Each step looked like it might be the last. Ephraim approached slowly, speaking in the low, calm tones he'd learned worked with frightened animals. "Easy there, girl. Easy now." The mare's eyes rolled white, showing the kind of terror that came from days of running, but she lacked the strength to flee further. Her head hung so low her muzzle nearly touched the ground. What stopped Ephraim in his tracks wasn't just the horse's pitiful condition, it was what she carried. Strapped to her back with leather ties that had been expertly knotted was a cavalry saddlebag, its dark leather scarred and weathered, but bearing the unmistakable brass fittings and U.S. stamp of military issue. The bag hung at an odd angle, as if weighted with something more than standard cavalry gear. "Where did you come from, girl?" Ephraim murmured, moving closer. The horse stood trembling, too exhausted to object when he reached for her bridle. There wasn't one, just a simple rope halter that had rubbed raw patches on her nose and jaw. Someone had rigged this animal for a desperate journey, not a leisurely ride. The saddlebag was secured with military precision, but the leather straps were damp with something more than sweat. Ephraim's experienced fingers worked at the buckles, noting the way they'd been fastened quickly but expertly by someone who knew cavalry equipment. When the flap fell open, he expected to find standard military supplies. Hardtack, ammunition, perhaps dispatches. Instead, his weathered hands discovered fabric-soft cotton that had been carefully wrapped around something warm and small. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was touching. With infinite care, he lifted the bundle from the bag, and the fabric fell away to reveal a sight that made his knees weak. A baby. A newborn infant, no more than a week old by the look of it, somehow alive and breathing despite what must have been an impossible journey through mountain wilderness. The child's skin held the healthy pink of new life, and as Ephraim stared in amazement, tiny fingers curled around his thumb with surprising strength. "Lord Almighty," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he'd thought long buried. "How in God's name are you still breathing?" The baby stirred at the sound of his voice, making the small mewing sounds newborns make when they're hungry or cold. Ephraim found himself cradling the infant against his chest, his body remembering motions from a lifetime ago when he'd held his nephew after his brother's death at Shiloh. The warmth of new life against his heart felt like a miracle after years of solitude. But questions hammered at his mind with military urgency. How long had this horse been traveling? Where had she come from? Who had placed a baby in a cavalry saddlebag and sent them both into the wilderness? And why, the most troubling question of all, why had they ended up at his cabin, miles from any recognized trail? The paint mare stood with her head down, flanks heaving. Ephraim could see she was dying, her body pushed far beyond its limits, but she'd completed her mission. Whatever impossible task had driven her through the mountains, she'd accomplished it. The baby was alive. Ephraim examined the saddlebag more thoroughly, finding it contained other items, a small leather pouch with a few pieces of jerky, a canteen that still held water, and folded papers that he didn't dare examine while holding the infant. Most intriguingly, a woman's silver locket had been tucked into a side pocket, its chain tangled with what looked like strands of long, dark hair. The wind picked up, whistling through the pines with a sound like mourning. Winter was coming fast to the high country, and despite his cabin's warmth, this was no place for a newborn. The baby needed proper care, medical attention, and answers that Ephraim didn't have. Much as he cherished his solitude, some responsibilities transcended personal preference. "Looks like we're taking a trip to town, little one," he said softly, surprised by the tenderness in his own voice. It had been so long since he'd spoken to another living soul, with anything approaching affection. He carried the baby inside and wrapped the child more securely in clean blankets from his own supplies. The infant seemed healthy enough, breathing steadily, responding to touch and sound. Someone had cared for this child well in its first days of life. But who and how had they ended up fleeing through mountain wilderness with a dying horse as their only hope? The paint mare had collapsed to her knees by the time Ephraim emerged from the cabin. He knelt beside her, running his hands along her neck in a gesture of gratitude and farewell. She'd given everything to complete this journey, and now her strength was spent. It would be a kindness to end her suffering, but first he needed to understand where she'd come from. Examining her hooves revealed the story of her journey in painful detail. The shoes were worn completely smooth in places and missing entirely from her right front foot. Stone bruises and cuts told of desperate travel over rocky terrain, probably for days. But most telling were the direction of the wear patterns. She'd come from the northwest, from the high passes that led toward the Canadian border. Ephraim fetched his rifle and ended the mare's suffering with a single, merciful shot. As the echo faded across the valley, he felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. For 15 years, he'd avoided entanglements, complications, the messy business of other people's problems. But this baby changed everything. There was no walking away from a child who'd been placed in his care by circumstance and fate. He saddled his own horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Jasper, who'd been his companion for 8 years. Jasper was mountain-bred, sure-footed on narrow trails, and strong enough to carry a man and supplies for days, if necessary. More importantly, he was steady-tempered and unlikely to spook at unexpected noises, useful qualities when carrying precious cargo. The ride down to Pine Hollow would take 3 hours on good trail, longer if snow had made the path treacherous. Ephraim secured the cavalry saddlebag behind his saddle and fashioned a sling from blankets to carry the baby against his chest, where body heat would keep the infant warm. Every few minutes, the child would stir and make soft sounds that went straight to places in Ephraim's heart he'd thought permanently closed. As Jasper picked his way carefully down the mountain trail, Ephraim found his mind returning to the war, to memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. The saddlebag was clearly military issue, but from what unit? The leatherwork looked older than current army standard, and the brass fittings had a patina that suggested years of use. More puzzling still was the question of how a cavalry horse had ended up in this remote corner of Montana carrying a newborn infant. The baby shifted against his chest, and Ephraim looked down into eyes that seemed far too alert for someone so young. There was something about this child that seemed familiar, though he couldn't place what. Perhaps it was simply the way all newborns possessed that quality of infinite possibility, reminding older men of dreams they'd once carried before life wore them down to practical necessities. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened and Pine Hollow's scattered buildings came into view below, Ephraim couldn't shake the feeling that this baby's arrival at his cabin was no accident. Someone had known exactly where to send that dying horse. Someone had trusted him with a responsibility that would change everything about his carefully ordered life. The question was whether he was ready for such change, and whether the past he'd tried so hard to escape was finally catching up with him after all these years of mountain solitude. Pine Hollow had grown since Ephraim's last visit 6 months ago. What had been a collection of rough wooden buildings scattered along Willow Creek now boasted a proper main street with boardwalks and even a few glass windows catching the afternoon light. The smell of fresh lumber and wood smoke hung in the air, mixed with the earthy scent of horses and the distant aroma of baking bread from the hotel kitchen. People stopped their conversations and stared as Ephraim rode down the main street. It wasn't just that the hermit of the high country rarely showed his face in town, it was the way he carried himself, the protective curve of his arms around the bundle pressed to his chest. Word traveled fast in small communities, and by the time he reached Doc Whitman's office, a small crowd had gathered on the boardwalk. Dr. Marcus Whitman was trimming his beard when Ephraim pushed through the office door. The physician was a compact man in his 50s, with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that moved with the practiced economy of someone who delivered half the babies in the county. His medical bag sat open on the desk, instruments gleaming in the lamplight. "Ephraim Cole," Doc said, setting down his razor. "Been nigh on 2 years since we've seen you. What brings you down from—" He stopped mid-sentence as he noticed the bundle in Ephraim's arms. "Good Lord, is that a baby?" "Newborn," Ephraim said simply, carefully unwrapping the blankets. "Found her. Him arrived at my place maybe 2 hours ago, riding a dying cavalry horse." Doc Whitman's eyebrows rose, but he'd practiced frontier medicine long enough to know that impossible stories often turned out to be simple truth. He cleared his examination table and gestured for Ephraim to lay the infant down. "Let's have a look then." The baby stirred as the warm blankets fell away, tiny limbs moving with the reflexive motions of new life. Doc Whitman's hands moved with professional skill, checking reflexes, listening to the heart and lungs with his stethoscope, examining the umbilical cord. The infant tolerated the examination with remarkable calm, dark eyes tracking the physician's movements. "Remarkable," Doc murmured after several minutes. "This child is in excellent health. Well-nourished, good color, strong reflexes. I'd say no more than a week old, probably less." He looked up at Ephraim with curiosity. "You said a cavalry horse?" Ephraim nodded and produced the saddlebag he'd carried down from the mountain. Doc Whitman examined the leather carefully, noting the brass fittings and military markings. His expression grew thoughtful as he opened his medical journal, a thick, leather-bound book where he recorded births, deaths, and notable medical cases for the entire district. The journal was more than just medical records, it served as an unofficial chronicle of the community's life. Doc flipped through pages filled with his careful handwriting, noting dates and details that painted a picture of frontier existence. Birth announcements, accident reports, outbreak records, and always the careful notation of anyone who'd gone missing or failed to return from journeys into the wilderness. "Here's something interesting," Doc said, running his finger down a page dated 3 months earlier. "Got a report from Sheriff Bradley about a cavalry patrol that went missing up north. Supposed to be escorting some civilians to safety, but they never reached their destination." Ephraim felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of civilians? Families, mostly. Folks fleeing some trouble down in Wyoming territory. Indian raids, claim jumpers, that sort of thing. Doc turned the page. 5 soldiers, maybe 8 or 9 civilians, including women and children, vanished somewhere between Fort Collins and the Canadian border. The baby made a soft sound, and both men looked down to see the infant's eyes open, staring up with that unfocused but somehow penetrating gaze newborns possessed. There was something about those eyes that tugged at Ephraim's memory, though he couldn't place what. The office door opened with a sharp bang, and Sheriff Tom Bradley stepped inside. He was a tall, rangy man with a greying moustache and the kind of steady presence that came from 20 years of keeping peace in rough country. His badge caught the lamplight as he approached the examination table. "Heard we had some excitement," Bradley said, his gaze taking in the baby, the saddlebag, and Ephraim's weathered face. "Mind telling me what happened up there, Cole?" Ephraim recounted the morning's events in crisp military fashion: the arrival of the dying horse, the discovery of the infant, the decision to bring the child to town. He handed over the saddlebag for Bradley's inspection, watching the sheriff's expression grow increasingly serious as he examined the contents. "This is Army issue, all right," Bradley said, holding up the leather bag. "But it's old, maybe 15, 20 years. See how the brass is tarnished? And this stitching here, that's handwork, not factory." He looked up at Ephraim. "You recognize anything about it?" Ephraim shook his head, but something nagged at him. The style of the leatherwork, the way the straps were configured, it reminded him of equipment he'd seen during the war, when supplies were scarce and soldiers made do with whatever they could find or repair. Sheriff Bradley continued his examination of the saddlebag's contents, pulling out the small pouch of jerky, the canteen, and the folded papers Ephraim hadn't dared examine while holding the baby. The papers crackled as Bradley unfolded them, revealing what looked like military correspondence written in fading ink. "Can't make out much of this," Bradley muttered, squinting at the handwriting. "But I can see dates. Looks like 1863, maybe 1864. And there's a signature here that might be..." He paused, holding the paper closer to the lamp. "Captain J. Morrison, if I'm reading this right." The name hit Ephraim like a physical blow. Captain James Morrison, his commanding officer during some of the bloodiest campaigns of the Civil War. The man who'd recommended him for the Medal of Honor after Antietam. The friend who'd shared his tent during the siege of Petersburg and talked about his plans for after the war, his hopes of starting a family and finding peace in the Western Territories. "You know that name?" Bradley asked, noting Ephraim's reaction. "Maybe," Ephraim said carefully. "Morrison's not an uncommon name." But Doc Whitman was watching him with the sharp eyes of a man trained to read symptoms and signs. "Something about this is familiar to you, isn't it?" Before Ephraim could answer, the baby began to fuss, making the hungry cries that indicated feeding time. Doc Whitman quickly rewrapped the infant in warm blankets and handed the bundle back to Ephraim, whose arms seemed to know exactly how to hold a newborn despite 15 years of solitary living. "This child needs proper care," Doc said. "Milk, warmth, and someone who knows about babies. Martha Henderson might be willing to help. She raised 7 of her own and helped deliver most of the children in this valley." "First things first," Sheriff Bradley interrupted. "I need to send word to the territorial authorities about this. Missing cavalry patrol, mysterious baby. This is bigger than anything Pine Hollow can handle alone." He folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the saddlebag. "Ephraim, I'll need you to stay in town for a few days while we sort this out." The old familiar weight of responsibility settled on Ephraim's shoulders. For 15 years, he'd avoided complications, entanglements, the messy business of other people's problems. But holding this baby, seeing the concern in these good people's faces, he realized that some responsibilities couldn't be walked away from. "I'll stay," he said quietly, "at least until we know more about where this child came from and what happened to its people." Outside, the afternoon was giving way to evening, and the first stars were beginning to appear over the valley. Somewhere out there, answers waited in the darkness, answers about a missing patrol, a dying horse's desperate journey, and why fate had chosen a solitary mountain man to receive this precious burden. But first, there was a baby to feed and a mystery to unravel, one careful step at a time. Martha Henderson lived in a tidy house behind the general store, where the scent of dried herbs and fresh bread always hung in the air. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of competent hands that had delivered babies, tended the sick, and held the grieving through their darkest hours. When Sheriff Bradley knocked on her door just after sunset, she took one look at the bundle in Ephraim's arms and ushered them inside without a word of question. "Poor little lamb," she murmured, taking the baby with the practiced ease of someone who'd raised 7 children of her own. "How long since this one has eaten? Don't rightly know," Ephraim admitted. "Found the child maybe 4 hours ago." Martha settled into her rocking chair and began the ancient ritual of feeding a hungry infant with milk she'd warmed on her stove. The baby latched on immediately, tiny hands gripping the cloth with determined strength. In the lamplight, with the child finally peaceful and fed, the resemblance Ephraim had been sensing became clearer. Something about the shape of the eyes, the way the infant's dark hair curled at the temples, it stirred memories he'd thought long buried. But before he could place the familiarity, Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat and produced another item from the cavalry saddlebag. "Found this tucked in a side pocket," he said, holding up a silver locket on a delicate chain. The metal caught the firelight as Bradley worked the tiny clasp open. "Thought you might want to see what's inside." The locket fell open to 3. Reveal a small daguerreotype, the image of a young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She was beautiful in the way of someone who'd known both joy and sorrow, with a slight smile that seemed to hold secrets. Beneath the photograph, engraved in flowing script, were the initials S.M. Ephraim's world tilted. The face in the locket wasn't that of a stranger, it was achingly familiar, though he hadn't seen it in over 30 years. Sarah Morrison, Captain Morrison's younger sister, who'd visited the army camp twice during the war. She'd been barely 18 then, full of life and laughter, bringing letters from home and sometimes fresh-baked cookies that the soldiers had treasured like gold. "You know her," Martha said softly. It wasn't a question, she'd seen the recognition flash across Ephraim's weathered features. "Sarah Morrison," Ephraim said quietly. "If this is who I think it is, she was the sister of my commanding officer during the war." Calculating. Near 50 by now, if she's still alive. Sheriff Bradley leaned forward. The papers in that saddlebag were signed by Captain J. Morrison. "Think it's the same man?" Ephraim nodded slowly. James Morrison had talked about his sister often during the long nights of the war. How she'd refused 3 marriage proposals because she wanted to see the world beyond their small town in Ohio. How she'd written to him about her dreams of the frontier, her fascination with the wild territories opening up in the West. She'd been spirited, independent, exactly the kind of woman who might end up in a cavalry escort heading for the Canadian border. "But this baby," Martha said, looking down at the sleeping infant. "If Sarah Morrison is the mother, and she's near 50, she shook her head. "It's possible, but uncommon for a woman that age to bear a healthy child." "Maybe she's not the mother," Bradley suggested. "Could be she was caring for someone else's baby. You said the missing. Patrol was escorting families. Maybe this child belongs to one of them." Ephraim studied the locket more carefully, noting details he'd missed in his first, shocked recognition. The chain showed wear, as if it had been handled frequently, treasured, but there were also newer scratches on the silver and what looked like a few strands of long, dark hair tangled in the lynx hair that seemed too dark and thick to belong to a woman of 50. "There's something else," he said, running his thumb along the locket's edge. "This hair caught in the chain, it's not grey, not what you'd expect from a woman Sarah's age." Martha held the baby up to the light, studying the infant's features with an experienced eye. "Look at the bone structure around the eyes, the shape of the nose. This child has good breeding, educated parents, and see how the hands are formed. Long fingers, like someone who might play piano or do fine needlework." The baby stirred, making soft sounds of contentment after the feeding. In the warm lamplight of Martha's sitting room, with the security of full belly and gentle hands, The infant looked peaceful for the first time since arriving at Ephraim's cabin. But questions multiplied like shadows. "We need to know more about that missing patrol," Bradley said. "I'll send word to Fort Ellis in the morning, see what they can tell us about Captain Morrison and his mission." "Fort Ellis?" Ephraim looked up sharply. "That's where Morrison was supposed to report after the war. He talked about it sometimes. Said Montana Territory needed experienced officers to help keep the peace." "You think he stayed in the army?" James Morrison was a career soldier. The army was his life, his calling. If he's still alive, he'd still be wearing the uniform. Ephraim paused, remembering his old friend's dedication, his sense of duty that had carried them both through the war's darkest moments. But 30 years is a long time. A lot can happen. Martha had been listening quietly while she settled the baby in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from a wooden crate and soft blankets. Now she spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent decades observing human nature. "This child was cared for with love," she said. "Look how clean the clothing is, how carefully the blankets were wrapped. Someone took great pains to keep this baby safe and comfortable. This wasn't abandonment. This was desperate parents making sure their child survived." The weight of that observation settled over the room like evening fog. Somewhere out there, parents, or at least one parent, had made the terrible decision to send their newborn away on a dying horse rather than face whatever danger threatened them. It spoke of circumstances so dire that certain death seemed preferable to staying together. "The horse came from the northwest," Ephraim said slowly. "High country, probably the passes near the Canadian border. Rough terrain, hard traveling, especially for civilians not used to mountain conditions. Winter's coming fast up there," Bradley added. If that patrol got caught in an early storm, he didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone in Montana knew stories of travelers caught unprepared by mountain weather. But even as they discussed practical matters, Ephraim found himself drawn back to the locket, to the face of the young woman who'd brought such brightness to a weary army camp so many years ago. If Sarah Morrison was indeed involved in this mystery, then his carefully constructed isolation was about to crumble completely. The past, it seemed, had finally tracked him down to his mountain sanctuary, delivered by a dying horse and a baby whose very existence demanded answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The next morning brought a telegram from Fort Ellis that changed everything. Sheriff Bradley found Ephraim at Martha's house, where he'd spent a restless night in the spare bedroom, listening to the baby's soft breathing and wrestling with memories he'd tried to forget. The sheriff's face was grim as he unfolded the yellow paper. "Captain James Morrison is very much alive," Bradley said without preamble. "Still serving, though he's been promoted to major. According to this, he left Fort Ellis 6 weeks ago, leading a special escort mission, exactly what Doc's records indicated." Ephraim felt his chest tighten. What kind of special mission? That's where it gets interesting. The telegram says Morrison was personally requested by name to escort a group of civilians to safety. But here's the strange part. The request came from someone claiming to be his sister, Sarah Morrison Caldwell. The surname hit Ephraim like a physical blow. Sarah had married, of course she had. 30 years was a lifetime. But hearing it made the woman in the locket suddenly real again, no longer frozen in the amber of memory, but a living person who'd built a life, taken a husband's name, faced whatever joys and sorrows the years had brought. Martha looked up from where she was changing the baby's clothing. "Caldwell, that name sounds familiar. Didn't we have some folks named Caldwell pass through here last spring?" Bradley nodded slowly. "Thomas Caldwell, his wife Sarah, and their daughter Emily. They stayed at the hotel for 3 nights while their wagon was being repaired. Said they were heading north to start a ranch near the Canadian border." He paused, studying the telegram again. But the wife didn't look anywhere near 50. Young woman, maybe 25 at most. Ephraim's mind raced through possibilities. If the woman wasn't Sarah Morrison, if she'd simply taken the name for some reason, then who was she? And why would she use Sarah's identity to request Morrison's specific help? The pieces of the puzzle seemed to shift every time he thought he understood the pattern. "There's more," Bradley continued. "The telegram mentions that Morrison carried special orders with him, classified orders that no one at Fort Ellis was privy to. Whatever this mission was about, it came from high up the chain of command." Martha finished dressing the baby and held the child up to the morning light streaming through her kitchen window. "Look at this little one's features in good light," she said thoughtfully. "The bone structure, the way the ears are shaped. This baby has breeding. But there's something else, something that reminds me of—" She paused, studying the infant more carefully. "Ephraim, come look at this child's eyes when they're open." The baby stirred at the sound of voices and opened dark eyes that seemed remarkably alert for someone so young. There was something in that gaze, an intelligence, a steadiness that seemed familiar. Ephraim found himself leaning closer, trying to place what he was seeing. "The shape of the eyes," Martha said softly. "The way they're set, the color. They remind me of someone, but I can't quite place who." "Sheriff." Bradley had been examining the military orders he'd found in the saddlebag, holding the yellowed papers up to the window for better light. Now he straightened suddenly, his expression sharp with discovery. "These aren't recent orders," he said. "Look at the date, September 15th, 1863. These papers are 34 years old." Ephraim felt the world shift beneath his feet. 1863, the height of the Civil War, when he and Morrison had been fighting their way through Virginia and Maryland. September would have been just after the Battle of Chickamauga, when casualties were mounting and every experienced officer was desperately needed. "May I see those?" Ephraim asked, his voice carefully controlled. Bradley handed over the papers, watching as Ephraim's weathered hands unfolded the documents with reverence. The handwriting was Morrison's. Ephraim would have recognized it anywhere. But as he read the orders, his blood turned to ice water. "Special Mission Authorization," he read. Aloud, "Captain James Morrison to escort civilian refugees from Harper's Ferry to designated safe zone behind Union lines. Refugees include women and children displaced by Confederate raiding parties. Mission classified due to sensitive nature of evacuees." The words blurred as memories crashed over him like a dam bursting. Harper's Ferry, where Morrison had been sent on a secret mission just before the Battle of Gettysburg. He'd been gone for 2 weeks, returning with shadows in his eyes and a reluctance to discuss where he'd been. The mission that had earned Morrison a commendation, but also seemed to change him in ways Ephraim had never fully understood. "There's more," Bradley said, pointing to the bottom of the page. "Look at the signatures, not just Morrison's commanding officer, but a civilian authority as well. Someone named Caldwell." Ephraim's hands began to shake. Thomas Caldwell, the signature was clear despite the aged ink. But Thomas Caldwell had been a Union spy, a man who'd operated behind Confederate lines, gathering intelligence about troop movements and supply routes. Morrison had mentioned him once or twice, always with respect tinged by concern. "If these papers are from 1863, Martha said slowly, "then why were they in that saddlebag with a newborn baby? What connection could there be between a 30-year-old military mission and what's happening now?" The baby made a soft sound, and Ephraim looked down into those alert, dark eyes again. This time, the resemblance hit him with stunning clarity. The shape of the features, the intelligent gaze, even the way the infant seemed to study faces with unusual intensity, it was Morrison. Not identical, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. "This is Morrison's grandchild," Ephraim said quietly. "Has to be. The eyes, the bone structure, this baby carries Morrison blood. But how?" Bradley asked. "If Sarah Morrison married Thomas Caldwell, and they had a daughter who's now about 25, then this could be their grandchild. But that still doesn't explain why Morrison was escorting them or why they ended up fleeing through the mountains." Martha had gone very still, The kind of stillness that came when a woman's intuition suddenly crystallized into certainty. "The young woman who stayed here last spring," she said slowly. "Sarah Caldwell. She was expecting, with child. I noticed it because she had that particular glow young mothers get, and the way she moved, careful, protective. She would have given birth sometime in the last few months." Martha looked down at the baby with new understanding. This could be her child. The implications hit them all at once. If Emily Caldwell, Sarah Morrison's daughter, had recently given birth, and if she'd been traveling with the missing cavalry patrol, then the baby's presence in the saddlebag told a story more desperate than any of them had imagined. Something went wrong with that escort. "Mission," Ephraim said grimly. "Something bad enough that a young mother chose to send her newborn away on a dying horse rather than keep the child with her." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the valley, matching the dark possibilities that seemed to multiply with each new piece of information. Ephraim found himself thinking not just about Morrison and the missing patrol, but about the kind of danger that could drive people to such desperate measures. The old soldier in him was awakening, analyzing threats and assessing resources. For 15 years, he'd avoided the complications of command, the weight of other people's lives depending on his decisions. But this baby changed everything. Blood called to blood, and duty called to duty, no matter how long a man tried to hide from both. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke, just as Ephraim was preparing to ride back up the mountain. Martha insisted he wait it out in town, pointing to the baby as reason, enough to avoid unnecessary risks. But Ephraim had other motives for staying. He needed information, and there was only one source he trusted to provide it without asking too many questions in return. Chief Running Bear found him at the hotel just after sunset, materializing from the storm-lashed darkness with the silent grace that had made the Crow such formidable warriors. The old chief's weathered face showed no surprise at finding Ephraim in town. News traveled fast along the mountain paths, carried by ravens and whispered through the wind itself. "Heard you found something that wasn't meant for you," Running Bear said in his careful English, settling into the chair across from Ephraim in the hotel's small dining room. Ephraim poured coffee from the pot the proprietor had left on their table. "Baby came to me on a dying horse. Seems like maybe the horse knew where to go." Running Bear nodded slowly, accepting the coffee with ritual courtesy. From a leather pouch at his belt, he produced a carved pipe. Not the ceremonial calumet used for important occasions, but a smaller, personal pipe for quiet conversation. The tobacco he packed into the bowl carried the sweet scent of kinnikinnick mixed with sage. "This pipe came from the northern hunting grounds," he said, lighting it with a coal from the fireplace. "Found it 3 days ago, along with other things that don't belong in Crow territory." Ephraim felt his pulse quicken. The tribal peace pipe from the outline was here, but not as he'd expected. This was evidence of something that had already happened, not something yet to be discovered. What kind of other things? Running Bear drew slowly on the pipe, letting the smoke curl around his words. "Cavalry gear, torn clothing, tracks of many horses, moving fast, carrying heavy loads." He paused, studying Ephraim's face. "Tracks of men on foot, some wounded, some carrying others who could not walk. The picture that emerged was grimmer than anything they'd imagined in Pine Hollow. Not just a missing patrol, but a running battle fought across difficult terrain, with casualties mounting and supplies running low. The kind of desperate retreat that ended with impossible choices and terrible sacrifices. How many men? Hard to say. Storm washed away much sign. But at least 20 horses, maybe more. Some carrying double-weight wounded riders, or civilians who could not ride alone. Ephraim thought of Morrison, older now, but still carrying the burden of command that had shaped their youth. Leading a mixed group of soldiers and civilians through hostile territory, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. It was exactly the kind of mission Morrison would accept without question, the kind that had made him a legend during the war. Any sign of who was chasing them? Running Bear's expression darkened. White men, but not soldiers. Tracks show different horses, different saddles. Men who live by taking from others, bandits, claim jumpers, the kind who follow gold strikes and army payrolls. How many? 15? Maybe 20. Armed, mounted, moving like men who know how to fight. The old chief's eyes reflected the firelight as he continued. But there was something else. Sign of a woman's horse, riding hard to catch up with the main group. Small horse, light rider, but pushing beyond what the animal could stand. Ephraim's throat tightened. Emily Caldwell, probably trying to rejoin the main group after giving birth. A new mother riding a foundering horse through mountain wilderness, carrying her infant child toward whatever safety Morrison's patrol could provide. The desperation of it made his chest ache. The woman made it to the group for a time, but then the tracks separate again, one horse breaking away from the others, heading south toward your mountain. Running Bear studied the pipe's glowing bowl. That horse carried 2 riders when it left the group, only the baby when it reached your door. The mathematics of survival were brutal and simple. Emily Caldwell had somehow gotten her newborn to safety, but the cost had been her own life. Whether from exhaustion, injury, or pursuit by the bandits, she died somewhere in the high country after ensuring her child would reach help. The main group? Tracks lead north, toward the old mining camps near Glacier Peak. Rough country, easy to defend but hard to escape from. Running Bear set down his pipe, fixing Ephraim with the kind of look that seemed to see straight through a man's skull to his intentions. "You're thinking about going after them?" It wasn't a question. Running Bear had known soldiers long enough to recognize the signs, the way Ephraim's shoulders had straightened when discussing tactics, the calculating look that came into his eyes when assessing terrain and enemy strength. The old warrior was awakening after 15 years of dormancy. "Morrison's my oldest friend," Ephraim said simply. "We took an oath once, never leave a man behind. Oaths are heavy things. They can pull a man down like stones in deep water, or they can give him strength to do what others cannot." Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. Wind howled through Pine Hollow streets, driving rain against the windows with a sound like gravel. But in the hotel's warm dining room, 2 old warriors sat in comfortable silence, each understanding what the other had left unsaid. "If you go north," Running Bear finally said, "you will need supplies, weapons, men who can ride and fight. The bandits will not give up easily. They've invested too much in this hunt. What makes you think they're still hunting? Because they left sign near your mountain. Fresh sign, maybe yesterday. They're tracking the horse that carried the baby, trying to find where it went." Running Bear's eyes glittered with something that might have been anticipation. They don't know about the hermit who lives in the high places. The man who learned to be invisible during the white man's great war. Ephraim felt something cold and familiar settling in his chest, the feeling that came before battle, when all the planning was done and only action remained. For 15 years, he'd avoided this moment, this return to the role that had defined him. But some things were stronger than personal preference. How long do you think Morrison's group can hold out against 20 armed men in winter conditions, with wounded and civilians to protect? Running Bear shook his head slowly. Not long. Maybe days, if they're lucky and well supplied. But luck runs out, and supplies don't last forever. The baby was sleeping peacefully upstairs in Martha's care, unaware that decisions were being made that would determine whether the child grew up as an orphan or with family still alive to claim her. Ephraim found himself thinking about the weight of responsibility, the way it settled on a man's shoulders like a familiar coat. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between the safety of his mountain sanctuary and the dangerous path that led toward whatever remained of Morrison's patrol. But tonight, in the company of an old friend who understood the burden of duty, he could prepare for what might be his final mission. The revelation came at dawn, delivered by a boy named Tommy who worked at the telegraph office. He found Ephraim and Running Bear preparing their horses behind the hotel, loading supplies for what they both knew might be a one-way journey into the mountains. The boy's face was flushed from running, his breath coming in visible puffs in the cold morning air. "Mr. Cole," he called out, "Sheriff Bradley says you need to see this right away." New telegram came in during the night. Ephraim followed the boy to the sheriff's office, where Bradley stood over his desk with the expression that mixed relief and confusion. The yellow telegram paper trembled slightly in his weathered hands. "This changes everything," Bradley said without preamble. Message came through military channels, marked urgent and classified. "It's from Major James Morrison himself." Ephraim's heart hammered against his ribs as Bradley read aloud. "Patrol. Established defensive position. Glacier Creek Canyon stop under siege by hostile forces. Stop. Request immediate assistance. Stop civilian casualties mounting. Stop critical supplies needed. Stop signed Morrison Major Commanding. Stop." The room fell silent, except for the steady ticking of the wall clock and the sound of Ephraim's blood rushing in his ears. Morrison was alive. After days of fearing the worst, of imagining his old friend dead in some nameless mountain pass, here was proof that the stubborn soldier was still fighting. "There's more," Bradley continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Look at this part at the bottom. It's marked Personal Message for Captain E. Cole, if present, Pine Hollow vicinity." Ephraim felt the world tilt. Morrison knew he was here. Somehow, across 34 years and hundreds of miles, his old commanding officer had tracked him down to this remote valley. But that was impossible unless— "Read it," Ephraim said quietly. Bradley cleared his throat and continued. "Ephraim, stop. Sarah dying, stop. Daughter Emily killed protecting grandchild, stop. Child must survive to carry family name, stop. Remember promise made Gettysburg, July 1863. Stop. Need iron coal, one last time. Stop your friend, James. Stop." The telegram fell from Bradley's hands as if it had burst into flame. In the silence that followed, Ephraim felt 30 years of carefully constructed isolation crumble like a dam made of sand. Morrison hadn't just survived, he'd been planning this moment, counting on bonds forged in war's crucible to bring his oldest friend out of hiding. "What promise?" Bradley asked softly. Ephraim closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him like incoming tide. July 1863, the aftermath of Gettysburg, when the Union Army had finally turned the war's momentum, but at a cost that staggered imagination. He and Morrison had been sitting beside a creek, cleaning their weapons and trying to process the carnage they'd witnessed. "We were talking about after the war," Ephraim said, his voice distant with remembering. "About what we'd do if we survived, where we'd go, how we'd live." Morrison had just gotten a letter from his sister Sarah. She was 18 then, full of dreams about seeing the frontier territories. He paused, feeling the weight of that long-ago conversation settling on his shoulders like a familiar pack. "James made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, if he couldn't protect his family, I'd step in. Look after Sarah, make sure she was safe." Ephraim opened his eyes, meeting Bradley's concerned gaze. "I gave him my word as an officer and gentleman. Sacred oath, witnessed by God and the battlefield dead. But that was over 30 years ago," Bradley protested. "Surely the circumstances have changed. A promise is a promise," Running Bear said from the doorway, where he'd been listening in respectful silence. "Among my people, such oaths bind a man until death releases him." Ephraim nodded slowly. The Crow chief understood what many white men had forgotten, that honor wasn't a convenience to be discarded when circumstances became difficult. It was the bedrock upon which a man built his life, the thing that remained when everything else was stripped away. "There's something else," Bradley said, picking up another piece of paper from his desk. This came with the telegram. Looks like it was torn from a larger document. The paper was stained and creased, as if it had been carried for a long time in someone's pocket. But the handwriting was clear enough, though it trembled with weakness or pain. It was a woman's hand, delicate but determined. "My dearest uncle, by the time you read this, I will likely be gone, but the daughter's child must live. The men who hunt us killed Thomas 3 weeks ago, and now they pursue us for reasons I cannot fathom. Emily gave her life to save her baby, riding through the night to reach the mountain man James told us about. The man who once saved James's life at Antietam, who carries honor like a sword. If you are the Ephraim Cole of legend, then you will understand what must be done. The child carries the Morrison name now, and with it all our hopes. Sarah Morrison Caldwell." The letter was signed with a shaking hand, but below the signature was something that made Ephraim's breath catch in his throat. A small, bloody handprint, not Sarah's, but tiny, perfect, clearly made by a baby's palm. Emily Caldwell's final act had been to press her infant's hand in her mother's blood, marking the letter with proof of life and continuity. "She knew," Ephraim whispered. Sarah knew she was dying, and she still managed to get this message out with Morrison's telegram. Bradley studied the letter more carefully. "Look at the postmark on the envelope this came in, sent from Glacier Creek Trading Post 2 days ago. Whoever carried this out from Morrison's position risked everything to deliver it." Running Bear approached the desk, his weathered features grave with understanding. "The trading post is 12 miles from the canyon where my scouts found the tracks. Someone rode hard through dangerous territory to make sure this reached the right hands." The implications crashed over Ephraim like an avalanche. Morrison wasn't just fighting for his life and the lives of his remaining patrol. He was orchestrating a complex rescue operation from a besieged position, using every resource and relationship he could command. The dying horse hadn't wandered to Ephraim's cabin by accident. It had been guided there, carrying not just a baby, but a message as clear as any military order. The old promises still held, and iron coal was needed one last time. "How long can they hold out?" Ephraim asked, his mind already shifting to tactical considerations. Based on what Running Bear's scouts reported, maybe days if they're well supplied and have good defensive positions. But winter's coming fast in the high country, and 20 armed men can maintain a siege longer than a mixed group of soldiers and civilians can endure it. Ephraim walked to the window, staring out at the mountains that had sheltered him for 15 years. Somewhere up there, his oldest friend was making his last stand, trusting that bonds forged in war's crucible would bring help when hope seemed lost. Sarah Morrison Caldwell was dying or already dead. Her final act, a desperate gamble that the right man would receive her message and understand what it meant. "I have to go," he said simply, "not just because of the promise, though that's reason enough. Morrison saved my life a dozen times during the war, and I never got the chance to repay that debt." "It's suicide," Bradley protested. 20 armed bandits against one man, even one with your experience." Ephraim turned from the window, and both Bradley and Running Bear saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there moments before: the cold, calculating gaze of a man who'd once led desperate charges against impossible odds and somehow lived to tell about it. "Not one man," he said quietly. "Iron Cole never fought alone." The transformation was subtle but complete. The hermit who'd hidden in the mountains for 15 years was gone, replaced by the legendary officer who'd earned the Congressional Medal of Honor through sheer audacity and unshakable will. Captain Ephraim Cole was back, and he had a war to fight. The transformation began with the map. Ephraim spread a large piece of canvas across the floor of Sheriff Bradley's office and began sketching from memory, his weathered hands moving with the precision of someone who'd once planned cavalry charges across contested battlefields. Every ridge, creek, and canyon he'd explored during 15 years of mountain solitude took shape under his pencil, creating a tactical masterpiece that would have impressed any military academy. "Glacier Creek Canyon," he said, marking an X in red ink. Natural fortress, water supply, commanding views of all approaches. Morrison chose, well, it's where I'd make a stand if I had civilians to protect. Sheriff Bradley studied the map with growing understanding. But it's also a trap. Only 2 ways out, down the main canyon or up through Devil's Pass, and that's barely wide enough for a horse. Which is exactly what the bandits are counting on, Ephraim said grimly. They don't need to assault the position, just wait for winter to do their work for them. When supplies run out and the cold becomes unbearable, Morrison will have to surrender or watch the civilians die slowly. Running Bear knelt beside the map, tracing the terrain features with one gnarled finger. My people know secret. Paths through this country, game trails that white men never see. Here and here. He pointed to seemingly empty sections of the canvas. Crow hunting parties have used these routes for generations. Could a small force reach the canyon without being detected? Small force, yes. Moving at night, knowing the land, understanding how to read wind and shadow. The old chief's eyes glittered with something that might have been anticipation, but such a force would need men who think like warriors, not soldiers. Ephraim felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, the burden of other men's lives, the calculations of acceptable risk, the terrible mathematics of war. But this time felt different. This wasn't about territory or politics or the abstract ideals that drove nations to conflict. This was personal, forged in bonds deeper than military duty. "I'll need volunteers," he said, looking up at Bradley. "Men who can ride hard, shoot straight, and follow orders, without question. But I won't lie to them about the risks. This isn't the kind of mission anyone walks away from unchanged." Bradley nodded slowly. Doc Whitman was a field surgeon during the war, served with Sherman's march through Georgia. He's too old for fighting, but he knows battlefield medicine. And there's Jake Morrison, no relation to your friend, but he was a cavalry sergeant before he came west. "Jake Morrison?" Ephraim's eyebrows rose. "The man who runs the livery stable?" "Same one. Lost his left arm at Shiloh, but he can still outshoot most men with his right hand. Been waiting for a chance to use his skills for something that mattered." The irony wasn't lost on Ephraim, a man named Morrison helping to rescue another Morrison, as if fate was weaving patterns too complex for human understanding. But he'd learned long ago that coincidences were often just providence wearing a disguise. What about supplies? Bradley walked to a wall map of the territory, pointing to various locations. "We've got ammunition at the sheriff's station, medical supplies from Doc's office, and Martha Henderson's been organizing the women to prepare food that'll keep in cold weather. Word's gotten out about what you're planning. Half the town wants to help." That surprised Ephraim more than he cared to admit. For 15 years, he'd been the hermit on the mountain, a curiosity more than a neighbor. But apparently his reputation from the war had followed him west, and the people of Pine Hollow remembered what Iron Cole had once accomplished. Martha appeared in the doorway as if summoned by their conversation, carrying the baby in a wooden cradle lined with soft blankets. The infant was awake, dark eyes tracking the movements of the adults with that unsettling intelligence newborns sometimes displayed. "This little one has been fussing," Martha said, settling the cradle near the map, almost like she knows something important is happening. Ephraim knelt beside the cradle, studying the tiny face that carried echoes of his oldest friend. The baby's hand reached up, grasping his finger with surprising strength, and he felt something shift in his chest, a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with military duty and everything to do with family bonds that transcended blood. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. "According to the papers in the saddlebag, she's Hope Morrison Caldwell," Martha replied. "Her mother named her. Well, Hope is what we're fighting for now." Hope. Ephraim smiled grimly at the appropriateness of it. Hope was indeed what they were fighting for. Hope that Morrison's patrol could be reached in time. Hope that the civilians under his protection could be saved. Hope that this baby would grow up knowing she came from people who never surrendered when righteousness was at stake. Jake Morrison arrived just after noon, his empty left sleeve pinned neatly to his shirt and his remaining hand resting on a Colt revolver that showed the wear of careful maintenance. Despite his disability, he moved with the fluid economy of motion that marked professional soldiers, and his eyes held the steady confidence of a man who'd faced death and found it less frightening than expected. "Heard you might need some help with a military problem," Jake said simply. Ephraim studied the man's face, noting the character lines around his eyes, the way he held himself with unconscious dignity despite his injury. This was someone who understood duty, who'd proven himself when it mattered most. "It's not your fight," Ephraim said carefully. "Any fight against men who prey on women and children is my fight," Jake replied. "Besides, I've been practicing one-handed shooting for 20 years. About time I found out if all that practice was worth something." Doc Whitman arrived an hour later, carrying a medical bag that had clearly seen hard service. The physician's soft hands and gentle manner concealed the experience of someone who'd performed amputations under cannon fire and treated wounds that would have broken lesser men's spirits. "I can't ride like I used to," Doc admitted, "but if you can get me close to where the wounded are, I can help, assuming any of them are still alive when we arrive." The bluntness of the observation didn't offend anyone. They were all experienced enough to understand that rescue missions often became recovery operations, and good intentions couldn't override the mathematics of survival. Running Bear had been quiet during these preparations, but now he spoke with the authority of someone whose people had been fighting for survival since time began. "The Crow Nation will provide 5 warriors," he said, "young men who know the mountain paths and can move like shadows when the need arises. This Morrison, he has shown respect for our people in his dealings. We do not forget such things." By evening, the plan was taking shape with the precision that marked professional military operations. They would travel light and fast, using the network of game trails Running Bear's scouts had mapped over generations. The approach would be made at night, when darkness favored defenders over besiegers, and the assault would focus on eliminating the bandits' leadership rather than engaging in prolonged combat. "The key is speed and surprise," Ephraim explained, using his pencil to trace movements on the tactical map. "We hit them hard, break their organization, and give Morrison's people a chance to break out. Once they're mobile again, we can establish a more defensible position and plan our withdrawal." "And if things go wrong?" Bradley asked. Ephraim met the sheriff's eyes with the calm steadiness that had once rallied broken cavalry charges against impossible odds. "Then we make sure the baby grows up knowing her grandfather died, fighting for something that mattered." The words hung in the air like smoke from a ceremonial fire, carrying weight that transcended their simple meaning. Everyone in that room understood they were preparing for something that might cost everything they had to give, but also something that would define who they were when all other definitions fell away. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light flakes that danced in the lamplight like promises of the brutal weather to come. Time was running out for Morrison's besieged patrol, but Iron Cole was riding again, and with him rode men who understood that some things were worth dying for. The baby slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware that her very existence had rekindled something that war had forged, and peace had tried to extinguish the brotherhood of arms that bound men together across decades and distance, creating obligations stronger than law and more enduring than life itself. The approach to Glacier Creek Canyon took 18 hours of hard riding through mountain wilderness that tested every skill Ephraim had learned during 15 years of solitary living. The rescue party moved in single file along game trails so narrow that a misstep would send horse and rider tumbling hundreds of feet into rocky chasms below. Snow fell steadily, muffling hoofbeats but also limiting visibility to mere yards ahead. Running Bear's Crow warriors led the way with the supernatural grace of men who'd learned to read the mountain's moods before they could walk. Behind them rode Jake Morrison, his reins secured around his remaining arm, managing his horse with the easy competence of someone who'd adapted to his limitations decades ago. Doc Whitman followed, his medical supplies carefully secured in waterproof packs, his soft hands gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled determination. Ephraim brought up the rear, every sense alert for signs of pursuit or ambush. The bandits weren't fools. They'd posted sentries along the main approaches to the canyon, and any conventional rescue attempt would have been spotted hours before, reaching Morrison's position. But Running Bear's secret paths bypassed those watchposts, threading through terrain so difficult that only desperate men would attempt passage. They reached the canyon rim just before dawn, the rescue party exhausted but undetected. Below them, Glacier Creek carved a winding path through stone walls that rose 300 feet on either side. At the canyon's widest point, where a natural shelf provided space for a defensive camp, the flicker of dying fires marked Morrison's position. Ephraim studied the scene through field glasses that had served him since the war, noting details that told the story of a siege pushed to its breaking point. The camp was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 30 people total, including women and children huddled around inadequate fires. Makeshift shelters, constructed from wagon canvas and salvaged lumber, provided minimal protection from the elements. But it was the defensive positions that revealed Morrison's tactical brilliance. Breastworks built from canyon stones created overlapping fields of fire that would make any direct assault prohibitively expensive. Rifle pits carved into the rocky ground provided cover for marksmen, and carefully positioned obstacles channeled any attack into predetermined killing zones. There, Running Bear whispered, pointing to movement near the canyon's mouth. The men who hunt them. Through the swirling snow, Ephraim could make out the bandits' positions. They'd established their own camp in a grove of pines that provided concealment while maintaining sightlines to Morrison's refuge. Smoke from their fires revealed at least 15 men, well-armed and confident in their numerical advantage. Jake Morrison crawled up beside Ephraim, his single arm managing the field glasses with practiced efficiency. Professional setup, he observed quietly. These aren't random claim jumpers, they're organized, disciplined, probably ex-military themselves. Ephraim nodded, grimly. He'd reached the same conclusion, which made the situation more dangerous than anyone in Pine Hollow had imagined. Military deserters or discharged soldiers turned to banditry, brought skills and knowledge that transformed them from mere criminals into formidable opponents. "Look there," Doc Whitman whispered, pointing toward Morrison's camp. "Movement by the largest shelter. Someone's hurt, badly." Through the glasses, Ephraim could see figures carrying what was clearly a makeshift stretcher. The careful way they moved, the protective positioning of others around them, suggested serious casualties among the defenders. Time was running out faster than he'd hoped. One of Running Bear's warriors materialized from the snow like a ghost, his painted face grave with urgent news. He spoke rapidly in Crow, gesturing toward the bandit camp, and Running Bear's expression darkened with concern. "They prepare for final assault," the chief translated. "Moving supplies, checking. Weapons. They plan to attack when the snow stops, probably within hours." The timeline had just collapsed. Instead of having time for careful reconnaissance and coordinated planning, they were facing an immediate crisis that demanded instant action. Ephraim felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded battle, equal parts fear and anticipation, the body's preparation for violence. "Can your men reach Morrison's position without being detected?" Running Bear studied the terrain below, noting wind patterns and sightlines with the eye of someone whose ancestors had perfected the art of invisible movement. Difficult, but possible. The creek bed offers concealment, and the falling snow will mask movement. "How long?" "1 hour to reach them, maybe less if we move fast." Ephraim made his decision with the speed that had earned him his reputation during the war. "Take Doc and get to Morrison's camp. Tell him Iron Cole sends his regards, and that the cavalry has finally arrived. Jake and I will create a distraction to cover your approach. What kind of distraction? Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. Ephraim smiled with the cold confidence that had once terrified Confederate prisoners. The kind that makes a lot of noise and draws attention away from where it needs to be. In the largest shelter at Morrison's camp, a figure moved weakly near the entrance, someone checking the perimeter despite obvious injury. Even at this distance, even after 34 years, Ephraim recognized the careful, methodical movements that had marked his old friend during countless military campaigns. James Morrison was alive, still fighting, still protecting the people under his command. But the broken cavalry saber lying near the shelter's entrance told its own story. The old warrior's strength was failing, and without immediate help, his final stand would end in defeat and death. Time for reunion would come, later, if they all survived the next few hours. Right now, Iron Cole had a battle to fight, and old debts to settle. The final battle began with a single rifle shot that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Ephraim had positioned himself and Jake Morrison on the high ground overlooking the bandits' camp, using the terrain advantage that had served him well during the war. The first shot took out the bandit leader's horse, creating instant chaos as the animal screamed and thrashed among the startled men. "Now we find out if old skills still count for something," Jake muttered, working the lever of his Winchester with mechanical precision despite his missing arm. The bandits responded with the disciplined fire of experienced soldiers, but their position in the open grove offered little protection against marksmen who held the high ground. Ephraim moved with deadly efficiency, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately placed. These weren't random criminals, they were dangerous. Men who'd chosen to prey on innocent travelers, and he felt no qualms about reducing their numbers. Below in the canyon, Running Bear's warriors had reached Morrison's camp under cover of the distraction. Through his field glasses, Ephraim could see Doc Whitman already working over wounded civilians, while Crow warriors took positions among the defensive breastworks. The reinforcement was minimal in numbers but massive in morale. Morrison's people suddenly had hope again. The bandit leader, a tall man with sergeant's stripes still visible on his faded uniform, rallied his scattered men with shouted orders that carried military precision. "Focus fire on the ridge. Maintain defensive positions. Don't let them pin us down." But Ephraim had fought too many battles to be impressed by shouted bravado. He shifted position along the rim, using rock outcroppings for cover, while maintaining a steady rate of fire that kept the bandits from organizing an effective response. Every few minutes, he would appear in a new location, take his shots, and disappear again like the ghost his old soldiers had called him. Jake Morrison proved that 20 years of practice had indeed been worth something. His single-handed shooting was devastatingly accurate, and his knowledge of military tactics allowed him to anticipate the bandits' movements. "They're trying to flank us," he called out, pointing toward a group of men working their way up the canyon's eastern wall. Ephraim acknowledged the warning with a nod and adjusted his position to cover the new threat. The flanking movement was textbook military doctrine, but it required the attackers to expose themselves while climbing difficult terrain. 3 shots later, the flanking attempt collapsed in confusion and retreat. In Morrison's camp, the effect of the rescue was electric. Soldiers who'd been preparing for a final, hopeless stand suddenly found themselves part of a coordinated defense. Civilians who'd been cowering in makeshift shelters began moving with purpose, following orders barked by their renewed commander. Through his glasses, Ephraim caught his first clear glimpse of his old friend in over 3 decades. Morrison was older, grayer, moving with the careful deliberation of a man dealing with serious injury, but his voice still carried the authority that had held broken lines together during the war's darkest moments, and his presence transformed demoralized refugees into determined defenders. The bandit leader made his fatal mistake when frustration overcame tactical judgment. Instead of maintaining the siege that had been slowly strangling Morrison's position, he ordered a frontal assault designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer aggression. It was exactly the kind of emotional decision that separated professional soldiers from dangerous amateurs. "Here they come," Jake observed, watching the bandits form up for their charge. "Looks like about 12 men left." Ephraim felt the dawn, familiar calm that settled over him before decisive action. This was the moment that would determine whether Morrison's long defense would end in victory or defeat, whether the civilians under his protection would live to see another sunrise. The assault came with wild yells and blazing guns, the kind of frontal attack that had been obsolete since the invention of rifled firearms. Morrison's defenders met it with the disciplined volleys of men who understood the value of coordinated fire, while Ephraim and Jake poured shots into the attackers from above. The charge broke against the stone breastworks like waves against a seawall. Men fell, screamed, tried to retreat, only to find themselves caught in overlapping fields of fire with nowhere to run. Within minutes, the bandit force that had terrorized the territory for months was reduced to scattered survivors, fleeing into the mountain wilderness. In the sudden silence that followed, Ephraim could hear the sound of his own heartbeat and the whisper of wind through pine branches. Below in the camp, figures were emerging from cover, helping the wounded, beginning the process of counting costs and celebrating survival. But near the largest shelter, one figure lay still beside the broken cavalry saber that had marked his family's military service for 2 generations. Major James Morrison had lived to see his enemies defeated and his people saved, but the effort had cost him the last of his failing strength. As Ephraim made his way down into the canyon, he found himself thinking not of victory or tactics, but of a wedding ring clutched in a dying woman's hand and the promise it represented that some loves transcend death and some duties bind the living to honor the dead. Spring came early to Pine Hollow that year, melting the snow that had held the valley in winter's grip and revealing a landscape transformed by more than just changing seasons. The baby, who'd arrived on a dying horse 6 months earlier, had grown into a bright, alert infant who seemed to recognize the sound of Ephraim's voice and would reach for him with tiny hands whenever he entered the room. Hope Morrison Caldwell, now simply Hope Morrison, as her grandfather had wished, sat in the wooden cradle that had become a permanent fixture in Martha Henderson's parlor. But today was different. Today, the women of Pine Hollow had gathered to dress her in a christening gown they'd sewn together during the long winter months, each stitch a prayer for the child's future, each delicate piece of lace a symbol of the community that had embraced her as their own. The gown was beautiful in its simplicity, white cotton, soft as spring clouds, with embroidered roses around the hem and tiny mother-of-pearl buttons that caught the morning light. Martha had insisted on adding a pocket over the heart, and in that pocket she'd placed the locket that had belonged to Sarah Morrison Caldwell, ensuring that Hope would always carry the image of the grandmother who died protecting her. Ephraim stood at the window of the church, watching the townspeople gather for the christening ceremony. It still amazed him how completely his life had changed since that grey morning when a paint horse had stumbled through his gate. The hermit, who'd hidden in the mountains for 15 years, was gone, replaced by someone who understood that isolation, no matter how peaceful, was just another form of death. Sheriff Bradley approached, carrying a letter that bore the official seal of the territorial government. "Word came through yesterday," he said, handing over the envelope, "about Morrison's commendation and the disposition of his estate." Ephraim read the letter carefully, noting the formal language that transformed a man's life into official paragraphs. Major James Morrison had been posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his final action, and his estate, modest but respectable, would be held in trust for his granddaughter until she came of age. More importantly, the territorial governor had officially appointed Ephraim Cole as Hope's guardian, recognizing the bonds of friendship and duty that transcended legal formalities. "There's something else," Bradley added, producing a smaller envelope. This was among Morrison's personal effects. Addressed to you. The letter was in Morrison's familiar handwriting, though weaker and more labored than Ephraim remembered from their war days. The paper was stained and creased, as if it had been written in difficult conditions and carried for some time before reaching its destination. "My dear friend," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my long gamble has succeeded and hope has found her way to safety. I always knew that if anyone could track you down in those mountains, it would be a dying horse, carrying precious cargo animals, have instincts about such things that we've forgotten in our civilized arrogance. I have no right to ask this of you after so many years, but I'm asking anyway. Raise her as your own granddaughter, teach her about honor, duty, and the kind of courage that doesn't require a battlefield to prove itself. Tell her about Sarah, about Emily, about the women who gave their lives to ensure she had a chance at hers. The war taught us many things, but perhaps the most important was that some bonds transcend time and distance. You were the best officer I ever served with, and more than that, you were the best man I ever knew. Hope deserves nothing less than the best, and that means she belongs with you. Your friend in this life and whatever comes after, James Morrison." The letter blurred as Ephraim read it a second time, feeling the weight of responsibility and honor settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Outside, the church bells had begun to ring, calling the community together for a ceremony that would mark not just a christening, but a new beginning for them all. Martha appeared. Beside him, Hope cradled in her arms, the baby's dark eyes bright with the kind of awareness that seemed to see more than infant vision should allow. "She's ready," Martha said softly. "Are you?" Ephraim looked down at the child who'd transformed his world, seeing in her tiny features the echo of friends lost and promises kept. "I think so. We'll figure it out together, won't we, little one?" The christening ceremony was simple but deeply moving, conducted by Pastor Williams with the kind of gentle authority that marked a man who'd spent decades helping people through life's passages. As the holy water touched Hope's forehead, she seemed to smile, though Martha insisted it was probably just gas, infants being what they were. But Ephraim chose to believe it was something more, recognition that she was surrounded by people who would protect and cherish her, who would tell her stories of brave women and honorable men, who would raise her to understand that some things were worth any sacrifice. After the ceremony, the entire town gathered at the hotel for a celebration that lasted well into the evening. Doc Whitman played fiddle, while Jake Morrison provided percussion with his single hand on a borrowed drum. Running Bear and his warriors shared traditional Crow blessings for the child's future, and even the usually reserved Sheriff Bradley was seen dancing with Martha Henderson to general applause. As the sun set over the valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Ephraim found himself standing on the hotel's porch, holding Hope while she slept peacefully in his arms. The baby's weight was slight, but the responsibility she represented felt as substantial as mountains. Tomorrow he would begin the process of building a real home, not a hermit's cabin, but a place where a child could grow up surrounded by love and community. He'd already spoken with the carpenter about additions to Martha's house, creating space for a growing family while ensuring Hope would always have the maternal guidance that only women could provide. The war was over. Not the great conflict of his youth, but the smaller, more personal war he'd been fighting against connection and purpose. Hope Morrison had won that battle simply by existing, by needing someone to love her unconditionally and teach her how to love others in return. As the first stars appeared overhead, Ephraim whispered a promise to the sleeping infant, to the friends who died protecting her, and to the future that stretched ahead like an unwritten story, waiting for its first chapter. "Welcome home, Hope Morrison," he said quietly. "Welcome home."